of the DMZ lead to a lasting peace between North and South Korea? Will the demilitarization of the DMZ lead to a lasting peace between North and South Korea? I'll just read it one more time. Will the demilitarization of the DMZ lead to lasting peace between North and South Korea? Would you like my question? Are my judges ready? It's a hot bit.
Whenever you're ready.
Sweet. Over the past year, it has become clear President Donald Trump has completely forgotten one thing: his forbidden romance with Vladimir Putin, and has even taken steps to cheat on him with Kim Jong-un. As the NPR writes, on October 12th of 2018, since their June 12th meeting that was revolutionary for the entire planet, President Donald Trump has sent letters between himself and Kim Jong-un, and this past month said that they fell in love. Now clearly, it seems as though pen pals aren't the best way to solve international conflicts. However, as the Brookings Institution illustrates, on June 7th of 2018, because of President Donald Trump continuously working with Kim Jong-un to alleviate tensions in North Korea, and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea working with Kim Jong-un to do the same thing, it has become clear peace is inevitable between the three actors. As the article continues to explain, because Moon Jae-in has now worked towards demilitarization of the DMZ, or the border between North and South Korea, also called the 38th parallel. Many people have claimed that this demilitarization is not just monumental, but symbolic of possible lasting peace between the two actors. Considering that Kim Jong-un has single-handedly destabilized Eastern Asia, and peace could help bring stability back to the region, it has become imperative that we ask ourselves today's question: has the demilitarization of the DMZ made it possible for lasting peace between North and South Korea? And the answer is absolutely, because it is a baby step forward in helping break tensions between the two actors. And we can see this more specifically through first, how it works towards alleviating an immediate military threat. Further, because of how it opens up communications between the two actors. And finally, because of how it creates a possibility of economic relations between North and South Korea. One of the best things about demilitarizing the most dangerous place in the world is that it alleviates the immediate threat of two countries completely blowing each other's brains out. And because of this, the first reason as to why the demilitarization of the DMZ will lead to lasting peace between North and South Korea is simply because it removes an immediate military threat that could cause an international conflict. Dictator Kim Jong-un, over the past several years, has been a naughty boy in international relations. As the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace illustrates, on March 13th of 2018, since taking power after his father died, it seems as though Kim Jong-un's perpetual military tests, the development of nuclear weapons, and his increased amount of soldiers placed on the DMZ has created anything but peace between himself and President Moon Jae-in of South Korea. However, because of recent progress in demilitarizing the DMZ, it has become clear that not only is an immediate threat being removed, but peace is incredibly possible. As the 38 North, a North Korean analysis-based publication explains, on September 13th of 2018, because dictator Kim Jong-un has now worked out a demilitarization with Moon Jae-in, the two actors on November 1st will create a no-fly zone on the border, remove all artillery embattlements, and even go as far as to removing almost all soldiers in place in the region. With North and South Korea continuously making strides forward in peace, they aren't just removing an immediate military threat, but taking the one thing away that could exacerbate their current tensions. Dictator Kim Jong-un's relations with South Korea is a lot like talking to your ex-girlfriend. You want to talk to them sometimes, and then when you actually pick up your phone to call them, you realize it's a terrible idea. However, because this is changing in the status quo, the second reason as to why the demilitarization of the DMZ will lead to lasting peace between North and South Korea is because it creates lasting connections that are unprecedented in the status quo. In the past, the United States' connections with North and South Korea has been rather lackluster, and communications have caused more conflict than anything pragmatic. As the Business Insider illustrates, on January 8th of 2018, because Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in in the United States all communicate by telling the press what they feel, but not actually talking to each other, rising tensions internationally has been inevitable. However, because of the demilitarization of the DMZ, new connections have been established. As the aforementioned 38 North explains in another article, published on July 30th of 2018, after both North and South Korea took steps to demilitarize the DMZ, they also established liaison offices, which haven't existed in the past, and create massive connections between North and South Korea that allow them to actually talk to each other. Luckily, because people no longer point guns at each other all the time on the DMZ, peace has become increasingly possible. As the South China Morning Post explains on June 7th of 2018, with regional issues revolving around human rights, and even the South China Sea embattling both nations against each other, if peace were to be found through this communication, they could work together to solve those problems. North Korea is kind of like an Extemp or a normal teenager. They're broke. And because they need money to evolve themselves in the status quo, the third and final reason as to why the demilitarization of the DMZ will lead to lasting peace between North and South Korea is because it creates an environment where economic trade is possible. Over the past several years, North Korea has been suffering from heavy sanctions because of their actions. As the Foreign Policy magazine explains, on June 7th of 2018, because of North Korea's increased steps to create military conflict and destabilization across Asia, the United States, the European Union, and pretty much the entirety of the UN have imposed sanctions on North Korea that limit their trade to only China and Russia. Because North Korea's economy has suffered from this, and demilitarization can provide solvency, it has become clear why the DMZ's demilitarization can lead us towards peace. As The Guardian explains on April 18th of 2018, because the DMZ isn't a physical barrier between the two actors, by demilitarizing it, supply lines have become increasingly possible in their formation. By creating more economic connections, they could lead towards trade deals and more progress between the two actors. As the Asian Review illustrates on July 7th of 2018, because 40% of North Koreans are in need of humanitarian aid, and 10 million people in the country are at risk of starvation and malnutrition, it has become clear that economic ties increasing won't just help North Korea's citizens, but lasting peace be established. Which brings us back to today's question. Will the demilitarization of the DMZ lead to lasting peace between North and South Korea? And the answer is absolutely. And we saw this more specifically through first, their current efforts to remove an immediate military threat. Further, because it can create more communication, and finally establish new economic ties. Although President Donald Trump is in love with Kim Jong-un, it's clear Moon Jae-in and the dictator are going to have a fantastic relationship in the future that's going to lead to peace and a better future between the two actors. Thank you. Might not even exist because the border will be demilitarized as a whole.
So considering that it's existed several decades and there has been no action from it in regards to threatening either of the countries, is this demilitarization a threat or just a symbolic gesture?
I don't know what you mean by anything threatening. Considering that the demilitarized zone has been not only symbolic, but also has facilitated a myriad of political issues. Because they have mined the border, they've just led to thousands of deaths of soldiers. And also they have put artillery embargoes that have even led to more military drills. Clearly the demilitarization of the DMZ isn't just symbolic, but a large step forward.
Okay, now going on to your first point, you talk about how it gets rid of an immediate threat, correct?
Yes.
So considering that North Korea still has missiles that they can very easily point towards South Korea, how is an immediate threat gone?
Well, considering earlier this year that they dismantled their entire nuclear program to work with the United States, those nukes aren't even in North Korea anymore.
Well, in their agreement with the United States, they have not yet dismantled their entire program. And not only that, but it's not only nuclear missiles, but normal ballistic missiles as well that they have.
Yes, I understand, and as I said in my speech from the 38 North article, North Korea has taken steps to dismantle their current nuclear arsenal, and they've also made a deal with this DMZ situation that they would stop conducting military drills, and also stop using these ICBMs to threaten South Korea.
Okay, perfect. I want to talk about your point on the economy. Is it the demilitarization leading to economic growth, or simply better relationships between the two nations?
Better relations that will be facilitated by removing the military forces from the DMZ.
But you talk about how the DMZ itself was a physical barrier towards trade. But considering they are both island countries and they both have ports, was there really a barrier to trade?
Yes, there was, because if they can't trade with each other on land, why should they go on a ship if they're on the same body of land? Without the DMZ, new supply lines could be formed, which could create economic progress and more connections between the two actors. Thank you.
An effective and humane tool of modern warfare. Are drones an effective and humane tool of modern warfare? And humane. Today in the 21st century, we are always surrounded by technology. In fact, technology is in almost every industry, both within America and internationally. And this is no different when it comes to warfare. In fact, an article from the Business Insider explains earlier this week, stating that when many people think of the military, they tend to think of things like guns, missiles, and ammo. And while this isn't incorrect, what countries are now trying to do is turn away from guns and missiles and towards things like technology. In fact, three major countries, or the United States, Russia, and China, have all combined been trying to invest in drones, artificial intelligence, and different types of technology to expand the way that they can see warfare. And in fact, both 2018 and years from now, we are beginning to see more and more presence, or a higher presence rather, of both drones and different pieces of technology in today's warfare. But in reality, the reasons why these countries are trying to invest more is because they know that whoever has the most and the best technology tends to stay on top. So consider that every country will always want to be on top when it comes to war. It is imperative that we ask today's all-important question: are drones an effective and humane tool of modern warfare? And the answer is an absolute yes, because they are more effective than everything else. More specifically because first, they can help to limit casualties. Second, they can more precisely supply aid. And last is because they are cost-effective. The first reason as to why drones are effective and a humane tool of modern warfare is because they can help to limit casualties in every way possible. In fact, an article from The Guardian explains on October 2nd of 2018, stating that right now, more and more countries are trying to look at war and trying to limit the amount of casualties that their military experiences, which is exactly why they're trying to turn to drones. Because they know that by investing more money into drones, they can try and prevent themselves from actually having to put military personnel on the ground anywhere across the globe. Plus, they know that with drones, they can see a larger impact with minimizing risk. In fact, the article goes on to explain that because these countries are trying to invest in these drones, they go to show that it is more effective than these other forms of warfare, simply because they can help to limit casualties not only for the military, but also for civilian casualties altogether. Meaning that with drones, they target not only more precisely, but at the same time, they can help to save civilian casualties from here on out. Plus, an article from the Los Angeles Times explains that these drones aren't only helping to limit casualties, but at the same time, when a soldier returns from home after a war, and they were forced to kill somebody in battle, they tend to experience different kinds of mental health issues. But when they have to kill somebody with a drone, while this isn't a complete solution, it does limit the problem. Meaning we aren't only limiting casualties, but we're helping the lives of veterans and anybody a part of the military. The second reason as to why these drones are not only effective, but also a humane tool of warfare, or rather modern warfare, is because they can help to more precisely supply aid. An article from the Financial Times explains just a couple of weeks ago, stating that right now, when countries are trying to supply aid, they're starting to turn to drones. Simply because when looking at every other form of care packages, like using planes or actual military personnel, they've begun to realize that it's not actually effective. An article from the Brookings Institution explains on September 18th of this year, stating that with drones, it can help to more precisely target exactly where the regions of the world need aid. In fact, just recently, a California company known as Zipline cooperated with Rwanda to try and help supply aid for people in this region. And as an outcome, they were able to invest millions of dollars into drones to supply aid to millions of people. Therefore, not only giving them things to help them with medicine, but at the same time, the information they need in order to try and survive just a little bit longer. And at the same time, these can't be compared to any other form of care package, because when we look at other forms of care packages, like being dropped from planes, we begin to realize that when these are sent out to different regions of the world, like Africa, it is prone to getting abducted by different people, like terrorist groups. But this isn't the same for drones, because an article from Financial Times explains again, but this time back on April 14th of 2018, stating that with drones, not only can it quantify and see exactly how much aid a person needs, but at the same time, it can make sure that the right people are getting what they need, rather than any terrorist group or anybody trying to intercept it. And, as an article from Bloomberg finally explains, that because of these drones, not only are millions of people getting exactly what they need to survive, but we are beginning to see the future of care packages and supplying aid change before our eyes. Because now, more and more countries, more and more governments, along with organizations, are turning to drones because not only is it more effective, but it is a humane tool of modern warfare. The last reason as to why these drones are not only effective, but also a humane tool of modern warfare is because they are cost effective. An article from Vox explains back in February of this year, stating that when many people think of drones, they think of it to be extremely expensive. But in reality, it's actually the opposite. The United States government has spent nearly $735 million on investing and creating more drones. And while this seems like a lot of money, it is because the United States military is trying to turn to things like cybersecurity, drones, and artificial intelligence, because they know that the future of warfare is all based off of technology. So, as a result, they are seeing that they are preparing for different cyber attacks all across our country. And, as the article goes on to explain, that when these drones are compared to different types of personnel, like military combat suits or planes, we begin to realize that these drones are far less expensive than anything else used, making them not only effective, but cost-effective as well. An article from Vox, or rather, this time an article from the Christian Science Monitor explains, on October 18th of 2018, stating that because of these drones, not only can more people get help, but the military supplying these drones don't have to suffer economically, making it better for the people and for the governments. When returning to today's all-important question, are drones an effective and humane tool of modern warfare? The answer is an absolute yes, because they're more effective than everything else. Or more specifically, because first, they can help to limit the number of casualties. Second, because they can more precisely supply aid. And last, is because they have the ability to be more cost-effective. So while when people now think of the military, they don't necessarily think of technology. It's time that in the future, drones and the military are linked as always.
So my first question is going to be about your first point. You discuss how it's going to limit casualties on civilians. However, considering the United States' drone campaigns in Afghanistan and Syria have killed over 200 children and 2,000 civilians, it has become clear it's a failure and is going to hurt more civilians, is it not?
No, so what these drones are actually doing, not only in America but all across the world, is that they're actually able to limit the amount of casualties of both military personnel and civilians, not only in Afghanistan, but in regions all over the globe.
So in your first point, you also discuss how this is going to alleviate PTSD. However, considering PTSD among drone pilots has increased over the past decade, due to them literally playing God inside these current air forces all across the United States, isn't that going to exacerbate the issue rather than solve it?
No, so rather than it's not solving the entirety of PTSD, but what it's doing is it's limiting the problem altogether. So while it's not a complete solution, it is helping for these military personnel.
In your second point, you discuss how the international community can use drones for aid. Considering you only mentioned that Rwanda is a country using this, but both the United States and China don't use these strategies, how are drones going to help increase access to aid?
Well, actually, the United States government isn't using this, but California's company Zipline has been partnering with Rwanda and other countries all across the globe to try and send aid to different parts of the world.
So in your third point, you discuss how drones are very cost-effective. However, considering terrorist organizations like ISIS, Hezbollah, and a myriad of others have used drone strikes that kill civilians to perpetuate terrorist recruitment, how is the damage the United States sustains from increased terrorist activity actually making these cost-effective at all?
Well, I'm saying that the drones are cost effective rather than actual airplanes or personnel or combat suits altogether. So I'm saying that the actual buying the drone is going to be more inexpensive than anything else in the military.
So you agree that the damage created by terrorist organization does outweigh the cost of these drones, correct?
No, I'm saying that the United States government is spending less money on drones, therefore it's less expensive all throughout the world for the military.
Best aid Yemen's refugees. How can neighboring countries best aid Yemen's refugees? Would anyone like my question or can?
Thank you so much.
Screaming outside. Boy. Audience ready? Ahmad Aglio-Berry is trying to find any remnants of his 9-year-old son. As the American conservative explains on August 9th of 2018, Ahmad's son, Ahmed, was killed in a school bombing attack in Yemen. However, after his father searched the rebel, he said he was unable to find anything to bury. A skull, a finger, nothing to identify his son anymore in the ashes. It's no wonder people are fleeing Yemen in droves. Because, after all, as Real Clear Defense explains in July of 2018, the Yemeni civil war is becoming increasingly violent as time goes on. It's basically a conflict between this rebel group, the Houthis, and the government. However, the Yemeni people are caught in the crossfire, with Saudi Arabia actively aiding the battle, going against Iran in some sort of twisted proxy war. However, because Saudi Arabia, a neighboring nation to Yemen, won't step in and help, other neighboring or at least very nearby nations like Oman and the UAE need to do their part in protecting people. So considering that we're 3 years into the Yemeni civil war, and if we want to avoid another Syria, we need to do what we can immediately, forcing us to ask today's question: how can neighboring countries best aid Yemen's refugees? And the answer is that they can take a humanitarian approach to try to save people. This can be seen in 3 ways. First, by improving work. Second, by aiding cash transfers. And finally, by saving Hodeidah port. When people are displaced from their home countries, they need to find a new job in a different one. But that's nearly impossible for Yemen's refugees to do legally. The first way in which neighboring countries can help aid Yemen's refugees is by ensuring to provide them better work protections. At the moment, Yemen really has no work protections for their refugees. After all, as the Economist Intelligence Unit writes in March of 2018, for the roughly 2,500 to 5,000 people who have left Yemen, it's a really small group of refugees who have actually fled, they're all trying to find jobs in Oman, neighboring Yemen. However, all of the work that they're finding is being done illegally, putting them at risk for human rights exploitation and incredibly low and overworking jobs. However, there's a solution to this crisis by following historical precedent. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Prosperity writes earlier in 2018 that neighboring countries need to invoke the Casablanca Protocol, put in place in 1965 in order to protect Palestinian refugees. It helps guarantee working protection, putting refugees on equal footing with Omani citizens, as well as making sure that they have government condoning for finding a job. And this protects them from a lot more than just low pay. Because if you're working illegally, then who's to stop anyone from putting you into human trafficking? As Bloomberg Magazine explains on July 11th of 2018, it seems that frequently, take Syrian civilians who are fleeing the Syrian civil war, they're drafted into human trafficking in their attempt to flee the nation. However, they can protect Yemen from having the same fate as long as they give them sustainable employment opportunities. The international community needs to listen to the old adverb, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. Because when life gives us Yemen, we give Yemen aid. The second way in which neighboring countries can help ensure protection for Yemeni refugees, is by making sure to give them cash transfers. Yemen's refugees have no money. Zero. Zilch. They're entirely broke. And that makes a lot of sense, because they come from a war zone. As Bloomberg Magazine explains in a separate article, this time also from earlier in 2018, for the 2.3 million internal refugees, meaning people displaced within Yemen from their homes, they frequently have to sell off all of their possessions to get any sort of cash on hand, meaning that they can't buy food or sustain any businesses that are still left in Yemen. However, there's a way to fix this. By following the recommendations of ADISO, a human rights organization who writes in 2016 that one of the best ways to counter things like famine and a humanitarian crisis is cash transfers, where you literally just give refugees and vulnerable populations straight up money. It sounds counterintuitive to giving them food aid, however, it's wildly successful. Countries like Oman should be the ones doing this, because they're the closest proximity to Yemen. And this has huge and awesome impacts for Yemen, because as the American Enterprise Institute joyfully explains in June of 2018, cash transfers are proven to bring 18% more people into the fold of humanitarian policy, meaning 18% more people actually get benefits than if it was simply food transfers. And it's affordable too, because it costs 25 to 35% less than straight up giving them food aid. The third and final step that neighboring countries to Yemen should take to protect their refugees is protecting Hodeida port. For the 2.3 million people still left in Yemen, their only source of international aid is Hodeida port at the moment. As The Guardian explains on October 7th of 2018, 70% of all food, and in particular medical aid, comes into Hodeida port. With Yemen currently facing a cholera outbreak 1.2 million people strong, there needs to be everything possible done to protect them. And the UAE, a nearby neighboring country to Yemen, should be the one to help. Because as the Washington Post explains in August of 2018, the UAE has asked for US permission to shut down Hodeida port, cutting off Yemen's last lifeline. If the UAE withdrew this request, the Saudi-led coalition said they wouldn't go forward without US permission. So, they'd be able to save that 70% of aid. And more importantly, the lives of the nearly 1.2 million people who might die if they don't get medical treatment for cholera. So, for everyone in Yemen and all of our moral responsibilities, today we ask the question, what can neighboring nations do to aid Yemen's refugees? The answer was that they can take 3 steps. First, protecting work. Second, cash transfers. And finally, Hodeida port. Although people like Ahmed may never find any remnants of his son, hopefully no one has to lose a child like that in Yemen ever again.
You talk about increasing work, but how can these countries properly increase work, or how can they afford to properly increase work?
Well, as I mentioned, Oman is the country who would be primarily responsible for invoking the Casablanca Protocol. However, the article actually explained that it could also be done through other Middle Eastern organizations that operate in these regions. So they could get aid funding, or they could ask the US for help. There are tons of opportunities for them to do this. Never mind the fact that actually protecting workers and having a new supply of workers creates a brand new opportunity for employers to expand.
Okay, so then at the same time, if they can properly afford to do so, how can they make sure that they get the right people the right jobs?
Well, that's how the employment sector works. Someone who is trained in Yemen as a doctor would typically not get a job as a carpenter. If they're expanding employment opportunities, specifically by aiding protections, making it legal for them to find employment, then they'll find the jobs that fit them. It's up to the refugee, not the Omani government.
And would it be the organizations or the surrounding countries that would be able to ensure that these people get the right jobs?
Well, the Casablanca Protocol was invoked by a Middle Eastern organization. However, Oman could do it on their own. So either or.
So you go on to talk about how you're trying to, or how you have to save a specific port within this region. But how can you make sure that this organization can save this port or get aid to this port while there is a war zone going on, including cholera?
As I mentioned, the Saudi-led coalition said they wouldn't go ahead in shutting down Hodeida port without the United States' permission. The UAE is currently the country requesting US permission. If they withdrew this request, then the United States wouldn't give their permission because we are a reasonable country. I'd like to hope so. And we can go ahead, and therefore we could go ahead and reserve Hodi.org in the 70% of aid that goes through it.
But you go on to talk about how there's a mass spread of cholera, so how can they make sure that they can safely get the aid to the people?
Well, because organizations like the Red Cross, World Health Organization, and UN are well equipped in dealing with disease-ridden areas. They know what to do and how to do it. As long as they can get there, Yemen's good.
America consider migrants from Central America to be refugees. Once again, should America consider migrants from Central America to be refugees? His new campaign strategy, well, it's really his old one, his bread and butter, immigration. As Business Insider of October 23, 2018 points out, President Trump is focusing on a caravan of around 7,000 Central American migrants concentrated from El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, currently making the trek up to the US southern border. He's doing this to fearmonger his base and to rally his base for the midterms. Essentially, they're afraid that the immigrants are going to come over and overwhelm the border. Considering the fact, however, that many of these migrants are escaping persecution at home and dangerous situations within their own respective nations, it becomes imperative to understand that the United States isn't just dealing with people coming up here for fun. It's a real crisis. And that's why the US has to look itself in the mirror and ask today's question. Should America consider migrants from Central America to be refugees? And the answer is yes, but unfortunately, it likely won't matter. And we'll see why, for three key reasons. First, the migrant caravan fits pretty much all the definitions for being refugees. Second, the international community and other nations have already designated them as such, and the United States should follow precedent. But third, current United States refugee policies will make the previous 2 points moot. But first, what we have to understand is that The Guardian earlier this month reported that President Trump was doing a bit of fear-mongering on the base of refugees. He said that there were some Middle Eastern terrorists within those 7,000 people coming up to the southern border. However, that's false. And that's the first reason why the United States should consider these migrants to be refugees, because they fit the bill. According to Vox of October 24, 2018, refugees, by international definition, are essentially people trying to escape persecution. And the United States has two very clearly defined subsets of rules depending on different types of migrants. One subset of rules is for an asylum seeker, or yes, a refugee who's trying to escape persecution. The other set of rules is for an economic migrant, someone who's just trying to move to gain a better job or better economic status. However, many of the 7,000 in those caravans are actually falling under both umbrellas. As the Toronto Star explains on October 26, 2018, there's a reason why the caravan actually grew from just a couple hundred to over 7,000. Because so many people are facing the exact same problems. And while they are trying to seek economic relief, it's extreme economic relief. Currently, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras are facing crises of gang violence and incompetent governance, leading to a disastrous economy that has led many in these 7,000 in the caravan to try to go up north. Sure, they could be considered economic migrants, but more likely than not, they're running for their lives. They can't put food on the table to feed their families, and they're under constant threat from gang violence. So under international definition, many of these people, yes, would fit the definition of being a refugee, and the United States should see them as such. But next, what we have to understand is that the United States' southern neighbor, Mexico, has already recognized many of these migrants to willingly give them refugee status. And that's what the United States should do as well. According to BBC of October 26, 2018, Mexico actually made a deal with this migrant caravan. They said they would give them work permits if they worked in the two southernmost states of Mexico. However, this isn't exactly a novel idea. In fact, Mexico realizes that these are people that could actually be put to work, and they're giving them refugee status as such. As NBC News of October 27, 2018 explains, Mexico has actually made this the first step in a plan to give these migrants permanent refugee status, meaning that Mexico sees their case as good enough to warrant a permanent refugee designation. Considering this fact, we have to realize, however, that ABC News of October 26, 2018 goes on to explain that those migrants actually rejected Mexico's offer, meaning that while Mexico were willing to recognize them as refugees, the caravan isn't stopping there. It's coming up to the US border, and the US border is going to have to make the same choice. President Trump's administration should likely follow precedent with the Mexican leader Enrique Peña Nieto and designate them as refugees, because the bill fits it and because it goes along with what the rest of the international community is thinking. But in the end, we have to realize that despite what the president does, it might not matter if they're designated refugees or not. And that's the third reason, while they should be designated refugees, it won't have a real impact. Because current US refugee policy has made it nearly impossible for them to gain asylum. According to the International Crisis Group of September 11, 2018, after 2016 and after President Trump took office, the amount of people actually granted refugee status in the United States has decreased significantly. As the Center for American Progress elaborates on September 13th, this is because of President Trump's hardline immigration rhetoric. Refugees from the South are viewed as being part of MS-13, and refugees from elsewhere are viewed as being Middle Eastern terrorists. This has led to refugees in America basically acting like the opposite of what the House of Representatives is going to do in November. They're getting whiter and whiter. As Reuters explains, on September 12, 2018, from 2016 to now, the amount of refugees has actually been cut down to a fourth of what it was. Even with refugees totaling 68.5 million worldwide, the US is only expected to let in 22,000, and they're letting in more people from Europe rather than other places. Considering this fact, it's clear that the Trump administration, even if they are designated refugees by everybody, isn't likely to even let them in, because they're worried about immigration as a whole. As such, even if the United States does designate these Central American migrants to be refugees, it likely won't make a tangible impact. Those 7,000 people are going to come up to the border, try and seek asylum, and be denied either way. So when we come back to today's question, should America consider migrants from Central America to be refugees? We can see that the answer is yes, but it won't matter. And we saw why for three key reasons. One, they do fit the bill of being a refugee. Second, the international community generally agrees that they're refugees. But third, current American refugee policy makes it clear that it won't matter. So even though President Trump may be campaigning hard on this issue for the midterms, trying to rile up his base on the immigration issue, whichever way it goes, it'll probably end up the same.
All right, just to start off, a question on your third point.
Yes.
The question asks, should the United States consider these people from Central America to be refugees? How does your third point answer that?
It's basically an extension of my first 2 points. I was saying that they should consider it to be refugees, but I was defining refugees like it actually matters, because generally it does. When people are designated refugees, it generally gives countries more rights to accept them, and it makes them more likely to actually be resettled. My third point was arguing that even if they were designated refugees, it literally wouldn't matter. So the question itself has a purpose, but I was just going a bit beyond.
So the question itself, like whether or not the U.S. actually designates them as refugees, has no tangible impact whatsoever.
I would say it has a very minimal impact.
Okay, returning to your second point. You say that the United States should follow the norm set by the rest of the international community, i.e. Mexico. Why do this if we've never listened to the international community before?
Well, it's actually also following U.S. precedent. In that international crisis group, quote, text I cited in my third point, it actually made the point that before 2016, the US was fairly open regarding refugees and likely would have actually considered these people to be refugees back then.
Okay, but what impact does that actually have on these people?
Once again, as I argued in my third point, it really doesn't have an impact on these people. The refugee designation really doesn't matter.
Okay, the definition of refugees, as you said, is people fleeing from crisis. Does that include economic crisis? Because most of the time it just means a humanitarian one.
Well, as I cited in the Vox article earlier, currently the US has two separate policies for migrants, basically, asylum seekers and economic migrants. However, as that Vox article also notes, many of the people in that 7,000 plus people in that caravan don't fall squarely into one box or another.
So we shouldn't designate them as refugees then, if they don't fall squarely into the box?
No, I'm saying that if they even have some sort of semblance of being an asylum seeker, we should credit them as such.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
UNHCR more effectively help refugees fleeing conflict? How can the UNHCR more effectively help refugees fleeing conflict? On January 27th of 1939, United States Border Patrol agents stopped the U.S. St. Louis, a ship carrying 900 Jews from Europe, and they sent it right back. Unfortunately, of the 900 people on that ship, 254 died in the Holocaust, despite the fact that by today's standards, they would have been internationally protected as refugees. You would have think that we've learned our lesson. But the Brookings Institution reports on October 23rd of 2018 that is far from the case. Because last year alone, 68.5 million people were displaced from their homes due to conflict around the globe. And yet, we in the more developed nations who don't have that level of conflict continue to turn them away at our doors. And considering that the very organization which is supposed to keep those refugees safe, the UN High Commission on Refugees, is basically powerless and only really exists to help the image of the UN, it's clear that we need to ask today's question. What can the UNHCR do to more effectively help refugees fleeing from conflict? And the answer is that the UNHCR needs to stop doing three key things that they have done in the past. First, they need to stop ignoring conflict. Second, they need to stop waiting until the issue becomes unsolvable. And finally, they need to do everything in their power to help internally displaced people. Band-Aids don't fix bullet holes. Frankly, that's something that the UN needs to learn. Because the first key thing that they need to do in order to more effectively help refugees fleeing conflict is to stop ignoring the conflict itself instead of just trying to fix the refugee situation. The East Africa Monitor explains on October 17th of 2018 that over the past few months, the UN has been sending aid workers to Somalia to help the people there who are fleeing from their homes because of Al-Shabaab. Frankly though, the UN is doing nothing to prevent Al-Shabaab from continuing to attack people. And even worse, despite clear warnings from local authorities that Al-Shabaab is stealing resources that are being brought into the country by UN aid workers, they have continued to do the exact same things that they were doing beforehand. What that means is that they've ignored key proof that there actually is a problem in the region, specifically with what they're doing, and simply continue to try and put a band-aid on the problem. Unfortunately though, The Guardian reports on October 24th of 2018 that they've done even worse things, including most recently repatriating Rohingya Muslims to Myanmar, despite the fact that there is clear evidence that a continued genocide is happening against them. The UNHCR doesn't really care about keeping people safe in the long term. They care about making themselves look good right now. They claim to be helping people in Somalia, but in truth, they're just enabling terrorists to do more harm. And they claim to be sending people back to their homes in Rohingya. But the problem is that they are just continuing to send them back into the jaws of conflict. Second thing, we have to consider all around the world the biggest problem, which is that we as an international community are extremely slow when we do our work. But refugees need an extremely fast situation, which is why the second thing that the UNHCR can do to fix the situation with refugees fleeing from conflict is to work significantly faster. Al Jazeera explains in a June 7th of 2018 report that one of the biggest issues that the UNHCR faces when it comes to dealing with Syria is that they need actual proof of ethnic cleansing or genocide going on against a minority in order to actually step in and take action. The problem is that there are very loose definitions. What that means long term is that because of red tape, the UNHCR is unable to do anything to help people in the short term. However, they could be doing more. And that's where the problems start. As the New York Times explains on August 22nd of 2018, that one of the biggest flaws of the UNHCR is that once they actually have the go-ahead to send aid workers into a region, oftentimes they send them in slowly and with limited resources because the UN is unable to allocate intense amounts of funding at once. So they're slow at going to action, and they're even slower at doing that action once they go to it. What that means for the refugees themselves is that they probably won't get the amount of aid they need, and they most certainly won't get it exactly when they need it. The UNHCR can fix this by helping and encouraging the UN to pass fewer pieces of legislation regarding their ability to help refugees. This is a huge problem, and the only way it can be solved is through legislation to help them speed up the process. But finally, we have to consider the people who are in the most danger. And those are the people who are fleeing conflict but haven't been able to escape. Which is why the third and final way in which the UNHCR can more effectively help refugees fleeing from conflict is by helping internally displaced people. As The Economist explains on October 13th of 2018, that a majority of the refugees on Earth today are internally displaced people, because 40 million of the 68.5 million refugees are internally displaced, essentially meaning that they are still in the country that they are trying to flee from conflict in. That's extremely dangerous, as the Center for Strategic and International Studies explains in an October 12, 2018 report, that part of the reason that Idlib is such a massive problem for the international community right now is because there are 3 million internally displaced citizens currently in the province. ISIS and other terrorist organizations use IDPs as a way to make sure that they can get away with doing anything they want and using them as human shields. The UNHCR can't do anything about them because they're technically still within the country, which means that they're not under international jurisdiction. The UNHCR needs to encourage the leaders of those countries and the leaders of the sects within the countries to go and help those refugees, and if possible, to send in aid workers to get them out. So when we return to today's question, what can the UNHCR do to help more refugees fleeing from conflict? The answer is to do 3 key things. First, to stop ignoring conflict. Second, to act faster. And finally, to help IDPs. Because if they don't, we are going to see more people end up like the victims of the USS St. Louis.
I just wanted to quickly touch on your first point. You said that the UNHCR needed to stop ignoring conflict. What exactly is in their jurisdiction, or other words, how can they actually step in? What's their power in this instance?
Their power is over refugees, but they have a special ability within the UN, because it's basically agreed upon that the UNHCR has the moral high ground on all issues. So if they simply apply to the General Council and ask them to deal with the conflict instead of ignoring it like they've done in the past, then they could easily fix the issue.
I'm under the impression that the General Council can't do much about it. It'd be under the jurisdiction of the Security Council to actually intervene. However, the Security Council has actually recently reviewed one of these reports on Myanmar, and China and Russia actually threatened to veto down any sort of intervention. How do we convince the Security Council or the General Council to act?
The problem is not a lack of action by the Security Council. The problem is a lack of attention by the General Council as well as the Security Council. Because although Russia and China are doing anything possible to stop action on a country that they view as favorable to them, the problem is simply that the General Council doesn't understand the extent of the issue. If other countries besides Russia and China understood the extent of the issue, they could also help more.
Okay, now I want to touch on your second point. How does the UNHCR, how can it designate when early stages of genocide or ethnic cleansing are in effect?
Well, oftentimes they can deal with reports coming out of the country from things like journalist groups and people who are fleeing the country in the first place. The problem is that oftentimes they don't actually pay attention to a situation until years after it started. Just look at the example you provided earlier, Myanmar, where Rohingya were fleeing as early as 2012, and yet the UNHCR didn't step in and do anything until 2017.
Okay. However, this actually comes back to the point that some situations can't be easily analyzed. What about the situation like even in the United States with the detention of migrants at the southern border? Would that be considered an early stage of genocide or ethnic cleansing?
No, because the difference is that these refugees are fleeing from somewhere where genocide or ethnic cleansing is happening. That's the issue that's being ignored, not the issue of them being turned away at the door.
How can Pakistan aid Afghans flooding into the country? How can Pakistan aid Afghans flooding into the country?
your first point was suggesting decreasing security to allow aid in, right?
Not decreasing security, but making regulations upon border control more accepting of NGOs.
Right, and your third point was about increasing security, right?
Increasing securities at the camps and for envoys delivering people past the border.
Right, but couldn't that increasing security at the camps easily interfere with your idea of helping more NGOs get in?
No, because increasing security at the camps is focused on making sure that there are actually guards and people able to watch over these people from any threats. I'm pretty sure guards would be able to identify a terrorist from an NGO.
Okay, so at refugee camps in Bangladesh, there's been serious issue with guards stealing aid that was intended for refugees. To what extent do you think that we'd see that if we upped aid, like you said in your first point?
Well, it's not something that can be very clearly analyzed, as those are two very different countries. But overall, if Pakistan were to actually focus on making sure these security details were qualified and had oversight on them, that issue could be avoided.
Okay, so then your suggestion is more security for the NGOs too.
Not for the NGOs. I thought you were talking about the security guards.
Okay, sounds good. So then let's talk about your second point, which was basically advocating to ensure that they get more infrastructure, right?
Basically.
So they'd need a lot more money for that, right?
Yes.
Didn't the United States, one of the biggest supporters of infrastructure in Pakistan, just pull out our aid?
Yeah.
So then where would they get the money for this infrastructure?
Well, actually, groups like the United Nations have specific projects and banks of money set out for specific cases just like this.
But are those United Nations programs really effective?
Well, they're effective in giving money to the countries that need it, and that's Pakistan's first step in ensuring security.
So what would Pakistan have to do to prove that they did need that aid?
They would have to show that the conditions in these refugees camps are unsafe, which is very clearly prevalent.